Here's Visual Studio 2013 open with the AdventureWorks library project that I created in an earlier video. First thing I want to talk about is this Entity Data Model Designer. This is easily the most obvious addition to the project that was created by the wizard. It's a conceptual model design that gives a view of the model that's the application's view of the data, showing the default entity data objects that the wizard created for the objects that I selected within the database. And you can scroll around and see customer and sales order header, customer address, and sales order detail, products category, products, product model, and so forth. So you can see, even from the relatively simple selections that I made from the AdventureWorks LT database, there's a lot of entity objects that were created. Now I have my screen at a relatively low resolution, but even if I had a very high resolution and I had a much more complex model, it could be very difficult to navigate around and find the different objects that I wanted to work with. Fortunately, the designer has some built-in features that make it all easier. And a lot of the features are right here, in these controls right down here. So I can do things like, if I hover over that, it zooms in on the diagram, so I can make it bigger. Or if I want to get more of a bird's eye view, I can zoom out. I'll just keep clicking that. Notice though that the font is now pretty much unreadable. But I can, if I knew this is the customer object and I wanted to look at related objects, I could kind of navigate and get a feel for it. And I can continue going out and scroll out so I get an overview of the entire model. So there you can see the basic structure of all of the objects within the model. So I'm going to go ahead and go back in here. But there's also a thumbnail view here. So that's this icon right here. So if I click it and hold down the mouse, I can just navigate around and get an overview of the model in the lower right corner, as well as navigate directly to different parts. So when I release the mouse, then I stay at that particular location. And then there's also this 100% zoom button right there, and that returns the model to its 100% zoom state. All right, so you have those buttons right there, but you can also click here, and the same basic options here with zoom, but with some preset options here. Zoom in, zoom out, zoom to fit if I want to see the whole model. Come back in here and zoom at a particular zoom level. Or I could go back directly to 100%, or even a higher zooming rate. Okay, so these kind of tools are invaluable when you're working with large, complex models. And in fact, even with this AdventureWorks database, at a lower resolution, they're useful. All right, so let me go back up to the top here and look at the individual entity objects. So here we have the customer entity as an example. So each of the entities that make up this conceptual model are shown by default with the list of properties. And those just correspond to the list of fields within the table. And then there are also navigation properties down here that provide a reference to related objects or collections of objects. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is widen this a little bit so we can see all the names there. And so again, this is the customer entity. And because the customer object includes these navigation properties to customer addresses and sales order headers, you don't need to use joins in your code. All you need to do is reference these properties, and that gives you references to those related objects. Okay, and then furthermore, each object here within the designer has its own set of properties. And so, we get the security warning again. All right. This is getting a little tiresome because as I move around things, it's using the template to regenerate and update code. So I'm just going to not show this message again. Okay, so there it's done doing whatever it needed to do behind the scenes. All right, so I can go over to the Properties window here, and I'll actually pin this open for the moment, and select the customer object. And now you can see all of the properties that are available that I can set for this entity object. All right, so now talking again about the properties here, I'm going to go over to Management Studio, where I have the AdventureWorks LT 2012 database open, and I'm going to drill down into the customer and the columns. And there you can see all of the columns, all of the fields that are included within the customer table. So I can expand that a little bit. And if you compare the two lists side by side, you'll see that there's a one-to-one relationship between the fields here, or I'm sorry, the properties here within the model and the fields within the table. Now, an entity data model doesn't have to have that kind of one-to-one correspondence, but the wizard by default creates an entity object with all of the fields. I can easily come in here and start deleting properties that I'm not going to be using within my application. Okay, another thing to notice about this is that Entity Framework has support for pluralizing object names. So once again, I have the customer entity selected, and you can see that I have the name of that object, customer. I can change that to whatever I want. If there's some different name that is better for the application, it can stay customer in the database, but I can use a different name here. But more importantly, when this object is used in a collection, the entity set name is customers, and that was generated automatically by Entity Framework. It has some pretty good smarts about how to pluralize objects. Now, it doesn't always singularize or pluralize names correctly, but for the most part, it does do it right. And even if it doesn't, you can always change the name here to something that is better. Okay, you can also explore the details of how Entity Framework initially maps objects in the database to the entity objects by right-clicking on the surface here and selecting the Mapping Details option. And then I reselect Customer Object, and there you can see the mapping between the database object and the object, the property of the entity. This is a very important part of what Entity Framework does, because it needs to know that if you change the first name of a particular object instantiated on memory after reading the data from the database, then it needs to know which field it should write that data to. And as you can see, it's the first name. It's an nvarchar coming from a string. And so that's the metadata that it has in order to map all of the data points within the object to the fields in the table. Now you can modify the mappings here and change the name of the entity object properties by selecting a property and just changing whatever the name is. So then the model will retain the mapping between your new name here and the first name field within the database. And then you can even add additional tables to a single entity object, because an entity in the entity data model doesn't need to correspond to just a single table. And there you're starting to get into some fairly advanced Entity Framework techniques, where you can have data for a single object coming from multiple tables. And you can even use multiple objects with data from the same table. So there's a lot of power that you have here, and a lot of that functionality is exposed through the designer. Okay, let's go back to the designer here, and I am going to zoom out. I'm going to zoom to fit it, just so you can see the overall model. Now, as I mentioned, it's zoomed out too far to read the object names. But what's important here is the relationship between entities throughout the objects, all of these lines all over the place. Now, these relationships in this initial default version of the model reflect those that are defined in the database itself. So AdventureWorks LT uses referential integrity, and so it defines these relationships. And the wizard picked up on those relationships and created the relationships within the model. All of the relationships and their types, one-to-one, one-to-many, and so on, mirror the corresponding relationships in the database. But like anything else in the model, you can customize these relationships by selecting them and changing their properties, remove them, or add new ones that don't exist within the database. And that's a very common scenario. I'll come into a new client. They have a database that isn't perhaps the best designed. There isn't referential integrity. Maybe it's not implemented at all, or only implemented sporadically. They don't want to change the database. They don't have control over it, something. You can add the relationships to the entity data model, so you have the benefit of them within the application, but then Entity Framework does the right thing about putting the data into the right locations within the underlying database. So hopefully you're starting to get a real feel for just how powerful Entity Framework can be. Now, you'll almost always want to spend some time cleaning up the model and customizing it after importing it from a database, especially if the database designer uses cryptic object names or omitted relationships between the tables before you build applications based on this model. That's going to make the model as useful as possible to the application and as easy as possible to use for developers. Now, this model based on the AdventureWorks LT database is fairly clean in terms of the names used for tables and fields, but you still may want to make some refinements. Keep in mind that the names you assign to objects and properties here in the model, no matter what they are in the database, will be the ones that you use in application code to access and update the data through those objects. The moral of the story is that the more time that you spend refining the conceptual model of the data here in the designer, the easier the entity objects are going to be to use and reuse within an application. To a reasonable limit, of course. You can get carried away refining a model. All right. Now, although the entity data model has this nice graphical appearance in the designer by default when the wizard opens it in Visual Studio, or if you come over here to Solution Explorer and double-click this EDMX file, that opens it up within the designer, this is really just a pretty face on some gnarly XML code. If you want to explore the XML to see how the data model works under the covers, then you can open it directly as XML. So to do that, I come back over here to Solution Explorer, I right-click on the model, and I want to open with. And it says the file awlt model.edmx is open in an editor with unsaved changes. Do you want to save your changes before invoking open with on this file? Now, the only changes I made to this point were basically zooming and maybe moving things around and so forth, but I'll go ahead and save the changes, but I don't have to. All right, then after a moment, you get this open with dialog box. Now, this is nothing specific to Entity Framework. This is a feature of Visual Studio. You can install and use different editors for different kinds of files. But in this case, I want to open this up as XML text instead of within the designer, which as you can see is the default. So I'll select the text editor there and say OK. And then I get this warning box that says that the document blah, blah, blah is already open. Do you want to close it? The thing here is that it can't have both the designer view of the model open at the same time as the XML view of it. The reason there is it just is too hard for Visual Studio to keep track of and sync the differences as you make changes and go back and forth. And there's no merging capability or anything like that. So Microsoft kind of punted, which I certainly understand, and just you can only have one view into it open at a single time. So do I want to close it? Yeah, go ahead and close it and open up the XML. All right, now I'm not going to explore the XML in detail in this part of the course, but I just want to point out a couple things. This file consists of two main sections in the file. The first is this EDMX runtime, and the second is this designer section. So EDMX runtime here contains the metadata about the database schema, the details of the conceptual data model, and the mappings between the two. That's really the meat of this entity data model. And then this designer section here contains metadata that guides the display of the model in the designer itself. All right, so that's all I'm going to talk about the XML here. But it's well worth your time as you advance your studies of Entity Framework to explore the XML behind the model in some detail. It's a great way to learn about how Entity Framework works and how it constructs an entity data model that then is used to generate the code that implements these different entity objects. But there are also some advanced features that the designer doesn't have support for. If you need to use any of those advanced features, then you're going to need to get your hands dirty with the XML and modify that code directly. Thankfully, though, you don't have to do that very often. Okay, so I'm going to go back over here to Solution Explorer. And as I mentioned, the wizard created a number of different files here. Some of these are code files, some support files, and the number of the files here depends on the options that you select, as well as the complexity of the database. And note that all of these other files are nested within this EDMX node here. So if I collapse that, they all disappear. Okay, so that's a handy way to organize everything within Solution Explorer. Now, most of these are C# class files, as you can tell by the CS extension there. But there are at least two .tt files here as well. These are T4 template files, which is part of Visual Studio's Text Template Transformation Toolkit, thus the T4. And that's what Visual Studio uses internally to generate code. But you can use these templates, modify them if you wish, in order to change how Entity Framework generates entity objects. Now that isn't a topic that I'm going to cover in this course, but just be aware that you're not stuck with the code that is generated by default by Entity Framework. You have this option of using these T4 templates in order to modify behaviors, add different objects, basically change the code however you want. Okay, so one of the things I want to look at is this context file. This is a top-level file. It contains the code for the AWLT entities object. Remember, I specified that name within the wizard. So as you can see here, this object inherits from DB context, which is one of the two main objects that implements the features of Entity Framework. And this provides most of the Entity Framework's features in the generated objects. So here's where you'll find the definition of various behaviors as well as collections of these objects. So I have a customer table within the database, and then I have a customer's entity set. And then if I scroll down, you'll see that there's also some supporting definitions for the stored procedures or user-defined functions that I included from the database. All right, and then the last thing I want to point out here is that this is implemented as a partial class. And that means you can easily extend this code to add business logic and other objects without changing this code that was generated by Entity Framework. And in fact, if I scroll up here to the top, there's a note that the code was generated from a template and cautioning you against making manual changes, because if you regenerate from the model or make changes from the database, this code is going to be overwritten. So by using partial classes, you can create your own partial class that isn't overwritten and extend AWLT entities. All right, then back over to Solution Explorer. The individual entity objects are implemented in the set of class files that's under the AWLT model.tt, that T4 template file. So here you'll find a code file for each table that I imported from the database, as well as various result files. You can see these underscore results that contain data returned by the stored procedures and functions that I imported, if they return a result set other than a single value or something corresponding to an entire table. Okay, if I open up the customer, you can see that I have this class customer. It's also a partial class, so I can extend this. It has a constructor, and then it has a property for each of the properties that are contained within that entity definition. And then I also have the navigation properties down here. And then go back over to Solution Explorer, and I have this UFN get all categories result. I'll open up that, and as you can see that user-defined function returns 2 strings and an integer. And this object will contain the results if I execute that function from within my application. All right, one more thing to show you is that there's AWLT model here. Now there isn't an AWLT model table within the database, but this is an additional file that isn't used in this particular model, but just the comment about not changing this file, because you'll lose it if you regenerate the file. So again, this isn't used in the project, but there may be other projects where you use some of Entity Framework's features in a different way that requires it to generate code within this file. All right, so the code in all of these files is where the magic of Entity Framework happens, letting you use entity data objects in an application to access data in a data store. You could probably have a rich, rewarding programming career using Entity Framework without understanding the details of this code. But if you really want to be an Entity Framework ninja and extend the entity data objects, you'll need to explore and understand this code at a relatively deep level. All right, last thing I want to show you here is one other file that the wizard created, and that's this app.config. This contains configuration information, just like in other .NET project types. And among other things, it contains the connection string that's necessary to access the entity data model and ultimately the database. And so you'll find that here, the connection string setting, and you have a single add element that adds that connection string to the collection. And as I mentioned, this has two major parts, the metadata that Entity Framework needs, as well as the ADO.NET connection string here. So this app.config file in this class library project contains all the information that the application and Entity Framework needs to get the model's metadata and connect to the database.